Hello everyone, I am Evely, and today I'm going to tell you a story. Enjoy your viewing. The first girl came to him by mistake. He hadn't planned on it. No, it was never part of the plan. It just happened, as if the universe itself had conspired to bring her into his life. But once he saw her, once his eyes locked with hers for the briefest of seconds, it was like a switch inside of him flipped. Something inside his soul twisted, contorted into a dark, insatiable hunger. His name was Roy, but the name didn't matter. He was nobody, just another faceless figure in a crowd. The world would never know who he really was, not until it was too late. It all began in the summer of 1987, a month that burned with an oppressive heat, where the air itself seemed to curl and twist with every breath. Roy had been walking down a quiet street, his steps aimless, his mind foggy. He wasn't looking for anything, not really. His routine was the same: go to work, come home, and fade into the background of life. But that day was different. She was there right in front of him. He didn't know her name. He didn't need to. It wasn't her name that mattered. It was her. She was perfect. The way her hair caught the sunlight, the gentle curve of her jaw, the soft gleam of her skin. Her eyes, wide and innocent, were locked on something just ahead, unaware of the stranger behind her. She was walking alone, her footsteps light, almost ethereal. She was a fleeting moment of purity in a world that had long since lost its innocence. Roy couldn't resist. He followed her. At first, it was subtle. He kept his distance, blending in with the shadows. A car passed and he ducked behind it. His heart thudded louder than it should have, as if his very body was betraying him. But he didn't care. She was everything. She was the one. He followed her for hours. She stopped at a coffee shop, then strolled into a bookstore. She was alone. Always alone. Roy knew that there was something beautiful, something untouched about her, something that made her the perfect object of his obsession. He studied her every move, savoring each moment, each breath she took. But the day was growing darker, and she was still unaware of the eyes that lingered on her. As the sun dipped beneath the horizon, Roy's pulse quickened. The shadows lengthened, and the street grew emptier. Finally, she walked down a quiet alley to reach her apartment. Roy's mind snapped. He wasn't sure when the decision was made, but it was there. He had to have her. He couldn't let her slip away. His stomach churned as he approached her from behind, quiet as a phantom. He had done this before, or at least he thought he had, but nothing was like this. There was no thrill, no excitement in the hunt. It was a certainty. He needed her. As she turned the corner, he was there. Before she could react, his hand shot out, grabbing her by the mouth, silencing her scream. The other hand wrapped around her waist, dragging her into the shadows. She struggled, kicking and fighting, but she was no match for him. She was weaker, smaller, just like all the others. It was then that he realized something horrifying. She wasn't just a victim. She was an object, a symbol. The more she fought, the more he felt alive, like something inside of him was being awakened. Something dark, something twisted. He never thought he would do this. Never. But he did. The alley became her tomb. Her body was a twisted sculpture, lifeless and broken in ways he couldn't explain. His hands trembled, but not from fear. No, his trembling was something else entirely. Satisfaction, exhilaration. There was something perverse in the stillness that followed, something that made him feel whole. When he was finished, when she was nothing more than a forgotten thing, he stood up and looked down at her lifeless body. For the first time in his life, Roy felt something like peace. It was like the weight of 1,000 years had been lifted from his shoulders. The world had been muted, as if the clamor of life had dimmed to nothing. But then came the aftermath. The sound of sirens, the flash of red and blue lights, the fear, the guilt, the voices in his head that whispered that she wasn't the only one. The voice was soft at first, a mere suggestion, but then it grew louder, clearer, until it was a chorus of demands, compelling him to do it again. Roy wasn't crazy. No, he wasn't like those people they talked about on TV, the ones who couldn't distinguish right from wrong. He could. He knew what he was doing. But he also knew he couldn't stop. The next girl came a week later. She was walking down a similar street, humming to herself, lost in some distant thought. Her hair was the same shade of brown as the first, and she had that same delicate grace that seemed to call out to him, demanding attention. And, just like before, he followed her. This time he didn't wait. This time he didn't need to. He approached her swiftly, like a shadow. He was quicker, more confident now. His hands didn't tremble this time. His mind didn't waver. He grabbed her from behind, dragged her into a dark alley, just like before. Her screams echoed in the night, but this time they were different. This time she fought harder, kicking and scratching. But it didn't matter. Her body would lie cold, just like the first. What terrified him, though, was how quickly it became a pattern. As if something inside of him had snapped. But it wasn't just a one-time thing. It was as if his entire soul had turned to something unrecognizable. The first one had been an accident, an impulse, but after that, the desire began to bleed into his thoughts. It was a fire that fed on its own. A hunger that he couldn't ignore. He couldn't stop. He couldn't. And with each new girl, each new body, he felt it growing, this monstrous hunger that threatened to consume him whole. Every death, every scream, only made the need for more stronger. He told himself he wouldn't hurt anyone else, that this was the last one, but the voices were too loud, too insistent. And then, one day it happened. He caught her. Her name was Mary. She was different, though. She wasn't like the others. Something about her made him hesitate. Mary wasn't like the others. There was something in the way she carried herself that unnerved Roy. She walked with purpose, as though she had a mission, a quiet determination that he didn't understand. He noticed her immediately, but he didn't follow her the way he had with the others. For the first time, a feeling of unease settled deep in his stomach. He had been watching her for days. She was so perfect. Her beauty was not like the fragile innocence of the others, but something deeper, something more profound. It was like she was untouchable. But Roy didn't understand why it made him feel unsettled. He needed her, needed to feel her beneath his fingers like the others. He had already taken so many. What difference did one more make? The decision came slowly, like a whisper in the back of his mind. But this time, when he moved to strike, something stopped him. She turned. Her eyes locked with his. It was the same chilling sensation he'd felt with the first girl, that same unnatural connection, that undeniable sense that she saw right through him. There was a clarity in her gaze that made him freeze. For a moment, Roy was paralyzed. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The dark hunger inside him fought to escape, but it was as if Mary's gaze had locked it away, stifled it. Her lips curled into a knowing smile, just as the sirens wailed in the distance. She knew. In a panic, Roy spun and ran. But he was too slow, too weak. The pounding of his footsteps echoed down the street, a beat too frantic to escape. He could feel her watching him as he ran, her eyes boring into his back, her presence somehow larger than the street, the alleyways, the entire city. She was everywhere. And just as he ducked into the darkness of an old parking garage, the cold press of handcuffs snaked around his wrists. His world spun. For the first time in years, Roy felt the creeping panic of helplessness. His knees buckled, and he collapsed into the concrete floor, his mind swimming with confusion. How had they known? Roy McAllister. A voice rang out from behind him. The officer's grip was firm, cold. You're under arrest for the murders of 3 young women. The weight of the words crushed him, but it wasn't the police that terrified him. It was her, Mary. Somehow, in a way that he couldn't fathom, she had always known. She had been watching him from the very beginning, waiting for him to slip up, to make a mistake. And the moment he felt the cold grip of handcuffs and the sting of realization, Mary had struck. She was the predator now, and he was the prey. But the terror didn't stop there. He was led through the cold, sterile halls of the police station, his body trembling like a leaf caught in a storm. The lights flickered above him, the hum of fluorescent bulbs adding to the suffocating silence that stretched between the officers. They didn't speak to him. They didn't need to. His silence was his confession. They shoved him into a holding cell, A small, damp space, its walls stained yellow with years of neglect. The door slammed shut, and for the first time in months, Roy felt the weight of isolation settle upon him like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The cell was eerily quiet. The sounds of distant conversations and murmurs from the other prisoners faded into nothing as he sat on the hard bench. His eyes locked on the walls. The air smelled stale, thick with the scent of sweat and despair. But still, in the silence, his mind raced. He had to get out. His obsession, his hunger. It was all still there, gnawing at him. He had to escape. But as he sat, his mind spinning in circles, something began to shift. It wasn't the need to escape anymore. It was something else, something deeper. She's here. Mary was here. Somehow she had found him. In this small, windowless cell he could feel her. He could feel her presence. The dark, suffocating weight of it pressing against his chest. He looked around, panic rising in his throat. But there was nothing. No one. Just the darkness. Just the cell. But then the voices started. They were soft at first, whispers that scratched at the back of his mind. He tried to ignore them, but they were too persistent. They spoke of things he had done, things he had hidden deep within himself, things that the world had never known. The voices told him to confess. They told him he deserved to suffer, to rot in this cell forever. No, he whispered, gripping his head as if he could stop them. No, I didn't. But they wouldn't stop. They never stopped. Suddenly, the door to his cell rattled open. Roy froze, heart leaping into his throat. His breath caught. It was her, Mary. She stepped into the dim light, her silhouette tall and imposing. Her eyes, those piercing, unrelenting eyes, were fixed on him. They glowed with something not human. It was then that Roy realized the true horror of his situation. He hadn't been chasing her. He had never been in control. She had been the hunter all along. Mary stepped closer, her heels clicking against the concrete. Each step sent a tremor of fear down his spine. He wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but his voice was gone. His limbs were frozen, his chest tight with terror. You never thought you'd be caught, did you, Roy? Her voice was like velvet, soft, but laced with something ancient, something cold. He couldn't answer. His throat was dry. The voices in his head had grown louder, maddened by the sight of her. You thought you could just take, and never be seen. But I saw you. I always saw you. Roy backed away, his eyes wide in disbelief. His mind was unraveling. The walls seemed to close in on him. The shadows around him grew longer, deeper. You are nothing, she continued, her smile widening, a dark, predatory grin. You were never meant to be anything. You're just a story, a tale to remind the world of how evil hides in plain sight. In that moment, the final cracks in his sanity gave way. The whispers in his mind grew deafening, their voices merging into one terrible truth. This was the end. He tried to scream. He tried to fight, but it was too late. Roy McAllister would never leave his prison. His body would rot in a cell, but his soul was already lost, consumed by the very obsession that had once driven him to murder. He would never escape her, because in the end he was her prey. See you in the next video. Don't forget to support me.